just like, especially if you're looking at the Rider-Waite deck, is the Rider-Waite deck's 56 minors are all like scenes of people doing things or interacting with someone else or stealing someone's swords or whatever. And these cards, in contrast, are just like, this is the Emperor and he's just sitting there on his throne, or Justice sitting there on his throne, or the Moon is like a scene, but it's kind of like a picture that there isn't too much interaction going on. It's more of just like these. And that sort of speaks to the archetype's permanence or sense of being sort of an eternal thing that's more than just a human. Like, these are the universal archetypes that people will say are beyond any one human. Like, these don't just exist in you, they're in our collective unconscious, or, you know, that kind of a deal. Like, they're like way bigger than one person. So, you know, one thing that I do when I'm doing like a 10-card Celtic cross spread for someone is, one of the first things I'll look for is how many of those cards showing up are major cards and how many are minor cards. And of course the major cards make up, well, 22 out of 78, so like just over, just under a third of the deck, right? So the minors are much more prevalent. If they have a lot of major cards show up in that reading, I know like this is a massive life thing for them. But if they're worried about something and like mainly they've just got minors showing up with maybe one major or two majors, I can very easily just like right off the bat without knowing anything else about what's going on say, this isn't a big deal. You're going to handle this wonderfully. This is nothing you haven't done before. This is just a little chopping wood, carrying water stuff. So like right there, you can say a lot about a larger reading just from taking note of how many cards in the reading are major versus how many are minor. So that's something that all of you guys can just, you know, pay attention to right now when you're doing the reading without knowing too much about the cards. There's a few different ways that we're going to explore the major arcana today. One of the easiest things to see in this 22 card array is that they're basically following the journey of the hero. You know, so really telling us a lot about like the universal stages of the life journey that we all go through, and all the heroes and heroines we've ever learned about, talked about, read about, have gone through. So you'll see cards come up and you'll be like, oh, that's just like, you know, Dumbledore in Harry Potter or whatever. And it totally is, you know, because he's an archetype. Throughout that journey of the hero, we go on different stages with the hero in the hero's journey. One of the easiest things to glance at in most decks right off the bat is there are two stages to this journey. There's a diurnal stage and a nocturnal stage of the journey, or there's kind of a daylight, light stage, and then there's a journey through darkness or the underworld. And you'll see that transition happen right around the Hanged Man and Death in the second row. Like if you just look at them like you're reading a book, you'll see like the Magician through to About Justice. All looks pretty light, maybe with the exception of the Hermit, who's kind of the wise man on the mountain. And then from Death onwards, everything kind of changes, and we go through this underworld journey before coming back out at the triumphant return at the sun. So that's one of the most basic ways to look at these cards as the hero's journey. You know, the diurnal part versus the nocturnal.
So the second part starts with the Hangman?
Just about, yeah. Yeah, the Hangman just about.
Okay, then do this and that.
I'd actually say to the sun, these cards are a little bit different. Over here, they're sort of resolution cards. So if you know anything about like the flow of a story, or the flow of just naturally how we think of a hero progressing, or a human developing, what we generally are looking at, the story in a nutshell, if you want the 5-minute, you know, major arcana lesson and you don't want to stay for the rest of the day, this is basically it. Hero comes to Earth, is raised by mom and dad, goes to school, finds a passion, something to fight for, goes out into the world, has his journey in the world, meets the wise man, gets a big picture idea of what everything's about, has a midlife crisis, goes on a descent into an underworld of sorts, or some sort of trial period, and then meets his deepest, darkest fears, conquers them, comes out at the triumphant return, at that point can kind of see where he's gone, is sort of the expert in his field, is very discerning, and celebrates happily ever after. So that, in a nutshell, is everything we're looking at today.
And this is the triumphant return.
That's the triumphant return, yeah. Or the rebirth, or, that's, he is risen, right? It's Easter, right? But, and we'll see these themes play out over and over again as we go through the day. So that's the main way that we're going to be looking at the major arcana cards. But we are also going to look at some patterns to kind of help you with the individual cards as they come up in the reading. One of the big patterns that I look at a lot is to do with what the first row cards are all about versus the second row and the third row's cards. And we talked about this a little bit last night. Rob and I were chatting over lunch yesterday and sort of correlating these three rows to mind, body, spirit, which is one way of seeing them. But I would actually say body, mind, spirit. That's sort of where I'm going with it. You have sort of a foundation row, a preparation row in the first row, 1 through 7. In the second row, we sort of have an into the world sort of a theme. And in the third row, we have sort of the higher spiritual development or the resolution coming up. So there's a lot of different ways that you can interpret those three rows, but just feel out what they feel like in terms of significance for you. And there'll be, there'll be a lot there that you can kind of look at as well. Another way that I like to look at it is development of the ego, and then getting to know kind of the unconscious and subconscious, with sort of the world in between as the middle row. So like the first row is like the development of conscious self, ego. And then like the second row being more, here's how the self interacts with the world. And the third row is more like, here's everything that's actually going on subconsciously and unconsciously that we're working through to become a more complete human being. We don't need to do that third row stuff, but it can really help if you actually want to be a fully actualized person on the planet. It's tough work, but somebody's got to do it. And it's usually you if it's about self-development. So that's another way that we're going to be looking at these cards today. A third way that we're going to be examining these cards is by column instead of row. We'll go into that a fair bit with some of them and not others. There is a really nice tie-in, for instance, between the Magician's Strength and the Devil, who you will see in whatever form they're in your deck in this first column of cards, so 1, 8, and 15. In a similar way, you'll kind of see a real big tie between the Emperor and Justice and the Moon. And we can even see that visually in some of the cards. So that's like the middle row, right? And we've got those nice columns on either side of those guys. And so we can kind of look at that. The Empress and the Wheel of Fortune and the Star actually really correlate in that way really nicely. We'll probably look at that row a bit. And definitely the Chariot, Temperance, and the World. Yeah.